Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 1. Pope Boniface VIII was the 193rd pope and one of the most controversial in history. During his time in power, Boniface committed some of the most absurd and unforgivable acts in the Church's history. One of the more controversial acts that Pope Boniface VIII performed was the issuance of Unum Sanctum. Released in November of 1302, it was a response from the Pope during his long-standing battle with the King of France. It essentially declared that the Pope acted on the authority of God, and that the Pope was the supreme ruler. He believed that everyone should bow to him. He also proclaimed that all Christians must pay taxes to the Pope and that anyone who disagreed could be excommunicated. An infamous incident associated with Boniface was his ruthless treatment of the Colonna family. The Colonna were powerful Italian nobles and opponents of the papacy, and Boniface ordered them to be tortured and imprisoned. He took their land by force and then gave it to his loved ones. He even threatened to excommunicate anyone who showed mercy to them. Pope Boniface VIII was also known for his excommunication of the King of France, Philip IV the Fair. In 1303, the king sent men to Rome to abduct him. They held him for 3 days and severely beat him. This 3-day ordeal took a toll and contributed to his death just a few weeks later. He was laid to rest in the Vatican. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 2. Pope Stephen VI did not have a great relationship with his predecessor, Pope Formosus. When Stephen came to power, Formosus had already been dead for 7 months, but having his enemy 6 feet under was not enough punishment for the new pope. Stephen had Formosus' body exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and put on trial. Stephen charged him with heresy, and a deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of his ex-holiness, who exercised his celestial right to remain silent throughout the proceedings. When clearly leading questions were asked, such as "Why did you usurp the papacy?" Formosus' counsel really let down his client by confessing, "Because I was evil." After the trial, Stephen ordered that the corpse be stripped of its robes and retroactively deprived of its popish title. The 3 fingers Formosus had used to bless people were cut off. His corpse was dragged through the streets of Rome and reburied in a common grave. A short time later, the body was dug up again and thrown into the river Tiber and was eventually recovered by a monk. The obscenity of digging up a rotting corpse and mutilating it after a ridiculous show trial was a bit much even by 9th century Roman standards. Within a few months of the Cadaver Synod, Stephen was deposed and tossed in jail. His successor, Romanus, reversed all of Stephen's decrees, restored Formosus to his rightful place, and celebrated his success by having Stephen strangled. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 3. For over 200 years, Ireland had a dark history of turning fallen women into slaves. Magdalen laundries, named for the biblical figure Mary Magdalene, had inmates imported from psychiatric institutions, jails, women with special needs, victims of rape and SA, pregnant teenagers, and flirtatious women. Initially, a majority of women entered the institutions voluntarily and served out multi-year terms in which they learned a respectable profession. But over time, the institutions became more like prisons. Though the institutions were run by Catholic orders, they were supported by the Irish government, which funneled money toward the system in exchange for laundry services. Nuns ruled the laundries with impunity, sometimes beating inmates and enforcing strict rules of silence. "You didn't know when the next beating was going to come," said survivor Mary Smith. Smith was incarcerated in the Sunday's Well Laundry in Cork after being raped. Nuns told her it was in case she got pregnant. She was forced to cut her hair and change her name. Nuns regularly beat her for minor infractions. Some pregnant women were transferred to homes for unwed mothers, where they bore and temporarily lived with their babies. Babies were usually taken from their mothers and handed over to other families. In one of the most notorious homes, the Bon Secours Mother and Baby Home in Tuam, scores of babies died. In 2014, Remains of at least 796 babies were found in a septic tank in the home's yard. Estimates of the number of women who went through Irish Magdalene laundries vary, and most religious orders have refused to provide archival information for investigators and historians. Then in 1992, the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity decided to sell some of its land. They applied to have 133 bodies moved from unmarked graves on the property, but the remains of 155 people were found. When journalists learned that only 75 death certificates existed, startled community members cried out for more information. Suddenly, women began to testify about their experiences at the institutions and to pressure the Irish government to hold the Catholic Church accountable and to pursue cases with the United Nations for human rights violations. As the Catholic Church remained silent, the Irish government released a report that acknowledged extensive government involvement in the laundries and the deep cruelty of the institutions. In 2013, Ireland's president apologized to the Magdalene women and announced a compensation fund. Due in part to the uproar surrounding the discovery of the mass grave, the last Magdalene laundry finally closed in 1996. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 4. The first Prime Minister of Canada, John Macdonald, said that in order for Indian residential schools to be successful, the Indigenous children must be removed from their parents. In 1883, he stated, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages." He said that they should spend their childhoods in schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. Before long, about 150 schools, run by Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches, opened across Canada in partnership with the federal government. Their aim was to eliminate the children's Indigenous knowledge and identity altogether. Far too often, the children never returned home. Those who survived the ordeal often describe a terrifying atmosphere of violence and abuse at the hands of priests, nuns, and other staff members at the schools. In 1907, Indian Affairs Chief Medical Officer Peter Bryce visited 35 Indigenous schools in Canada and found that 25% of their students had died. At one of the schools, 69% had died. The schools, Bryce noted in his report, were poorly constructed and had bad ventilation. Tuberculosis spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, other officials noted issues with overcrowding, faulty heating, and inadequate nutrition. "We cried to have something good to eat before we sleep," recalled Andrew Paul, a survivor of the Clovic Roman Catholic residential school. "A lot of the times the food we had was rancid, full of maggots, stink." But on a number of occasions, survivors witnessed death firsthand. Some victims were beaten so brutally that they died due to their injuries. And some survivors have testified to seeing babies born to young female students who had been raped by priests, deliberately killed. Despite horrific stories like these, the schools operated for more than 100 years. The last Indian residential school in Canada didn't close until 1996. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 5. Pope Julius III was a career diplomat and head of the Papal States from 1550 until his death 5 years later. At this time, the Church was already notoriously corrupt, and he much preferred to spend his time in the pursuit of pleasure. In his case, that meant devoting himself to young boys. Once on the papal throne, Julius exhibited little interest in papal affairs. Instead, he looted the church treasury to renovate his mansion in Rome, splurging on the best, including Michelangelo, to transform his residence into a magnificent palace. However, that was not the most scandalous thing about his pontificate. That distinction goes to his proclivity for young boys. His greatest controversy, the Innocenzo scandal, named after a 13-year-old beggar with whom Julius fell passionately in love. He had the street urchin adopted into his family, then made the uncouth and barely literate Innocenzo a cardinal and showered him with church offices and benefits. It was an open secret that they shared a bed. Julius ignored all advice that his unseemly passion for the teenager opened him to ridicule. Innocenzo was not the first teenage lover made cardinal by Julius. That distinction went to a 16-year-old whom Julius made a cardinal as a reward for his bravery, because he did not cry after he was bitten by one of the Pope's pet monkeys. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 6. 15th century, Pope Alexander VI did everything from selling church offices to hiring 50 prostitutes in one night to secure his place as one of history's most corrupt popes. From the start, the young man born Rodrigo Borgia bribed his way to the top and used his position to enrich his friends and family. The infamous Borgias were Spanish nobles who attained power and wealth in Spain and across the Italian peninsula during the Renaissance. Back then, it was common for high-ranking men of the cloth to have mistresses. Rodrigo Borgia had two famous mistresses, Vanessa de Catane and Julia Farnese, both married noblewomen. He fathered 7 children between them. He appointed 10 of his relatives to the College of Cardinals, including his 18-year-old son Cesare and the younger brother of his mistress, Alessandro Farnese, who later became Pope himself. He endowed his closest allies with fiefdoms across the Papal States and often practiced simony, the sin of selling church offices. Alexander enjoyed a lavish lifestyle filled with expensive ceremonies. In 1501, Alexander and his son, Cesare, held what's become known as the Banquet of Chestnuts. It was reportedly an all-night orgy that involved the services of 50 prostitutes. Papal Master of Ceremonies, Johann Burchard wrote in his diary that the Pope and his family gleefully threw chestnuts on the floor, forcing the naked women to grovel around their feet like swine. They then offered prizes of fine clothes and jewelry for the man who could fornicate with the most women. Burchard states, "Grapes and acts of incest are countless. Pope Alexander VI died in 1503 after a mysterious disease caused his body to bloat and become discolored. Numerous ambassadors who attended Alexander's funeral commented upon how awful his body looked. They described him as entirely black and as black as the devil with the numerous candles and torches surrounding him in the Roman summer heat, only making it worse." Julius II, who succeeded Alexander, famously said, "I will not live in the same rooms as the Borgias lived." He desecrated the Holy Church as none before, indeed. The Borgias' apartments remained sealed until the 19th century, more than 300 years after their misdeeds. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 7. John Wycliffe was a famous English theologian and vocal critic of the Church. The Church hated him so much that even after he passed away, they exhumed his corpse and burned it many years after he died. Among Wycliffe's many criticisms was a belief the Church should give up its worldly possessions and that the Scriptures are the only reliable guide, not self-serving popes. He said that there was no scriptural justification for the papacy's existence and attacked the riches and power that popes and the Church as a whole had acquired. He also believed that Christians should learn the faith for themselves, that Scripture needed to be translated into their own languages. His most important achievement was the first complete English translation of the Bible, issued from 1382. In 1384, Wycliffe suffered from a stroke and passed away, but in the year 1415, he was condemned as a heretic by the Council of Constance. Then in the spring of 1428, a group of churchmen dug up the bones of Wycliffe and burned them. This grisly enterprise was carried out at the instruction of Pope Martin V. The Pope also ordered that all his books be burned. His ashes were thrown in the River Swift. Wycliffe has been hailed as the morning star of the Protestant Reformation. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 8. Where is my baby? Luisa Torres wondered after waking up from general anesthesia on March 31, 1982. Your baby is dead, Sister Maria Gomez Valbuena told her as she lay in bed at the Santa Cristina Maternity Hospital in Madrid. You gave birth to nothing, the nun said. It was a lie. Throughout much of 20th century Spain, a criminal network of doctors and nuns stole anywhere from 40,000 to 300,000 babies from their mothers at birth. 80-year-old Sister Maria Gomez Valbuena was the first person to be charged. She passed away in 2013. This system started with Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain who ruled from 1936, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, until his death in 1975. The practice may have originally been born from Francoist ideology, which promoted the domination of the pure right-wing over inferior left-wing families. But over the years it changed, as babies began to be taken from parents considered morally or economically deficient. The guiding principle was that the child would be better off raised by an affluent, conservative, and devout Roman Catholic family. The system outlived Franco's death in 1975 and carried on at least into the 1990s as an illegal baby trafficking network. More than 60 years have elapsed since some of these babies were snatched from their mothers, meaning that many of the victims, parents and children, are no longer alive. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 9. The lesser-known Basque witch trials in 17th century Spain contained unique characteristics compared to other historical witch hunts and is the largest witch hunt in world history. For hundreds of years, no one really knew the extent of the witch trials that took place in Basque around this time period, mainly because the Catholic Church hadn't supplied the records. But the Vatican eventually opened its archives to researchers so that they could better understand not just the motivation for the Inquisitions, but also the methods. It was at this point that the sheer scope of the Inquisitions first became known. Witch trials were not new in Europe, where they'd been occurring sporadically since the 1400s, but between 1609 and 1614, up to 7,000 people were accused of witchcraft in Basque. One common theme in the Basque witch trials was the accusation that witches engaged in night flights or gatherings. Accused witches were often said to have flown on broomsticks or animal familiars to attend meetings with the devil. This theme is shared with other witch trials, but was particularly prevalent in the Basque trials. One poor woman, Inessa Gaxon, had to go through witch trials twice. She was first accused of witchcraft in France. She was tortured and imprisoned. Eventually, she was pardoned by the Catholic Church, but was left disabled due to her imprisonment. Inessa then moved to Basque, where she was accused of witchcraft again. Her independent nature and clear physical handicap made her easily stand out. During this time, at least 2,000 people were tortured and 11 died. 6 were burned at the stake. Officials made sure to burn symbolic effigies of the ones who died in jail. To put it in perspective, although roughly 20 people were executed during the Salem witch trials, only about 200 people were investigated. And while Salem mostly targeted women, the Basque trials were equal opportunity. Aristocrats, men, clerics, and children were among the accused. Local authorities even called in the Spanish Inquisition for help with their witch hunts. In 1611, an inquisitor named Alonso Salazar Frias traveled through the Basque countryside in order to collect confessions and pardon witches who renounced evil. But he was skeptical, as he had seen no solid evidence of witchcraft while there. When the majority of the confessed retracted their statements, the matter was sent on to the Inquisitor General. He, in turn, ruled in 1614 that all cases be dismissed, bringing an end to the biggest witch trial in history. Dark Side of the Catholic Church Part 10. After the end of World War II, thousands of children were sent to Australia as part of a child migration program. The children, aged between 3 and 14, were poor or orphaned. Catholic organizations told these children that in Australia they would all have better lives. There were two main purposes for this program: to ease the population of orphanages in the UK and to boost the population of the colonies. In 1946, Laurie Humphreys, a 13-year-old boy living in an orphanage in Southampton, was sent to Australia along with hundreds of other children. He was classified as a war orphan and given to understand that his father was dead, even though he was very much alive. They were taken to Boys Town, a home for youngsters at Bindoon, a Catholic institution. The boys were immediately made to work hard labor and no one was taught to read or write. Then there was the horrific abuse. The priests walked around with thick 18-inch leather straps hanging from their black outfits. At every opportunity, the children were brutally hit on the backside, body or on the soles of their feet. Laurie stated, "Like most of the boys, I would try to keep clear of Father Eugene, the creepy Catholic priest in charge of the place. He had a weird way of talking to you, and took a keen interest in whether us boys kept our private parts clean. Being one of the older boys, I managed to steer clear of the sexual abuse, but we were all aware that it went on." Perhaps the most hated figure at the institution was Brother Kearney, a big Irishman who arrived in 1948 to teach us a trade. He liked to prod us with a walking stick, and was one of the cruelest people I've ever met. He could turn on the charm when dealing with government officials, and was even given an MBE. When he died, they put up a statue of him at Boys Town, and one night it was decapitated, which tells you how much he was loathed. Clifford Walsh was 9 years old when he arrived in Bindoon Boys Town. He commented on the isolated areas of these institutions, stating, "We were 60 miles from Perth. We had no parents, no relatives. There was nowhere we could go. These pedos must have been in hog heaven. I was sobbing uncontrollably for hours. It was a living hell." In 1956, 3 British officials visited Australia on a fact-finding mission to inspect 26 institutions which took child migrants, and delivered back a fairly critical report, identifying issues such as lack of expertise in child care and concerns of the remote rural locations. The report, however, made no mention of sexual or physical abuse, and the child migration continued. Bindoon remained open until 1966.